you. Thank you. It's a lot of people. Thank you. Let me begin by thanking all of you for being here this afternoon, for your understanding that it is my wife, Jane, who is the brains in the family. And let me thank the Essewan bookstore, one of the important independent bookstores in the community. And let me thank the Writers Block, and let me thank the Saban Theater for hosting this event. Thank you all. And let me begin with maybe a news flash that some of you already know, and that is that by a landslide defeat, our French brothers and sisters have defeated Marine Le Pen. And while Mr. Macron may not be the choice candidate that some of us would have wanted, there is no doubt that the people of France said no to racism, no to xenophobia, and no to anti-immigration hysteria. Now, I want to talk about the book, and I hope you enjoy it. In my somewhat prejudiced point of view, I think it's a pretty good book. The book talks about a few of us up in North Country, state of Vermont. We'd love you to visit us sometime, talking about whether it made any sense for somebody who had no money, no name recognition outside of Vermont, to run for president of the United States, and the kind of things that we contemplated and what happened during the campaign, and obviously the issues that we raised and the significance of the campaign. And that's what's in the book. But before I discuss the book, one or two minor things have happened since the book was written before the election. And as some of you may know, Donald Trump won the election. And I want to discuss briefly what that means, the implications of that, and where I believe as a nation we have got to go. And what I do know is that if there is not a political revolution, which is what the book you are holding is about, if we do not transform not only American politics, but the Democratic Party, if we do not bring millions of working people and young people into a level of political participation which does not exist today, unless we do that, I worry very much about the future of this country. And let me also tell you, and some of you may agree and some of you may not agree, and that is that the reason, I believe, one of the reasons that Trump won is that Democrats and the media did not fully appreciate or feel the reality of the pain being experienced today by many, many millions of Americans. Now, I think what we can say without any hesitation, and something that everybody who is not hyper-partisan would agree with, is that after 8 years of the Obama administration, the economy was in much better shape than it was at the end of the Bush administration. That is true. Unemployment went down, the deficit went down, and of course we overcame the horrific financial crisis that we faced in 2009 when Obama first came into office. But, and here is a very big but. Well, you hesitate always to use a big but, does not sound exactly what I mean, but you know what I mean. And that is, and this is something that Jane and I learned about as we traveled all over this country. I went to 47 states and she went to 2 more. And that is the media doesn't talk about it, and the Congress doesn't talk about it, but there is an enormous amount of suffering that is going on in this country. It's going on in Los Angeles, it's going on in Vermont, it's going on in West Virginia and in Kentucky, and it's going on all over this country. And what I believe from the bottom of my heart is that we will not move this country forward in a way that we must unless we first have the courage to talk about the reality, no matter how unpleasant and painful that reality may be. We have got to talk about it. Because what happens when you don't talk about it, when the corporate media ignores it, as they do, and when most politicians ignore it, as they do, is that people turn on the television and they see all the blabbering gossip and all the talking heads talking this, that, and the other thing, and people are saying, what about my life? Do they understand that I have a beautiful 2-year-old and I cannot afford $15,000 a year in child care? Do they understand that the public schools that my kid is going to is totally inadequate? Do they know that I'm 20 years of age and I did well in high school, and yeah, I should go to college, but I can't afford to go to college? Does anybody know or care that I graduated college 10 years ago, $60,000 in debt, and I'm not making any headway in paying off that debt? Because making $10 an hour is not enabling me to put away money to pay off that debt. Does anybody know that in San Francisco or LA or Burlington, Vermont, I am paying 50% of my limited income for housing because there's no affordable housing? Does anybody care that I'm a woman in an office doing the same work as the guy across the hall, but I'm making 79 cents on the dollar? Does anybody know or care that my job went to China and now I'm working flipping hamburgers making 50% of what I used to make? Does anybody know that I am 60 years of age and I'm supposed to retire in 5 years, but I got no money in the bank? I'm one of the 50% of older workers who have nothing in the bank. Anyone know that? Does anybody know? I'll never forget, I was at a supermarket near my home in Burlington, and a woman came up to me and said, Bernie, my husband and I have 1 kid. We want to have more kids, but we're not, because he's working 3 jobs and I'm working 2 jobs, and we don't have the time to be the parents we want to be. Does anybody know or care that despite an explosion of technology in which the average worker today is producing much, much more than was the case 20 years ago, that people today are working unbelievable hours, 50, 60, 70 hours, 2 or 3 jobs, and they don't have the time to spend with their kids? Anybody care about that? And while we have made some progress in recent years, does anyone care that we got veterans in this country sleeping out on the streets? Never forget, I was in Kentucky some years ago, met with some administrators of a local high school in a poor area of Kentucky. And this guy said, "Senator, on my football team, there are 11 kids who are homeless because their parents are on they're drug addicted. They can't stay at home." On one football team, 11 kids. Does anybody care that in America today, in an unprecedented way, not only in American history, in modern world history, we are now seeing for millions and millions of Americans a decline in life expectancy? Did you know that? That for the first time in the modern history of this country, working class people are seeing a decline in life expectancy, living shorter lives than their parents because of the hopelessness and despair they are feeling. Go to southern West Virginia, and what you will find is an opioid and heroin epidemic. People on alcohol, people committing suicide. One of the few flourishing businesses, and what a tragedy it is, and this is not funny. One of the few flourishing businesses in that part of the country are funeral homes, because they are now dealing with the bodies of people who are 40 or 45 years old, dying of drugs, alcohol, or suicide. Massive homelessness, massive hopelessness in parts of our country. Those are some of the realities that we have got to address as a nation. We've got to ask, why in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, why do we have 43 million people living in poverty? We have got to ask a question that for me is not difficult, but is something that is uncomfortable for many people. And that is the issue of income and wealth inequality. Because when we raise the issue of income and wealth inequality, you're not just talking about racial justice, that's enormously important. You're not talking about gender equality. You're not talking about fighting homophobia, all of which is enormously important. What you're talking about is taking on the people who own this country. And when you raise those issues, there are a lot of people who become a little bit nervous. But if you read the book, what you will find is that one of my major concerns is that in this country, and I've got to lay it out on the table, and again, you're not going to see this on TV. You can watch one of the 800 TV channels that you get, and it ain't going to be on any of the 800 of them. And it ain't going to be discussed in Congress. But here is the truth, in my view. And that is, this country is rapidly on its way to becoming an oligarchic form of society. And what oligarchy means is a society which is owned and controlled by a small number of very wealthy individuals. Now, when I was a kid, we read about oligarchy in Latin American countries, small countries. A handful of families controlled the economics and the politics of some small countries, and we read about that. But it is important to understand what is happening in America today. And that is that in our country now, the top 1/10 of 1%, not 1%, 1/10 of 1% now owns as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Got that? In the last 30 years or so, 35 years, there has been a massive transfer of wealth. You know, Republicans get very nervous when you talk about wealth redistribution. But the truth of the matter is, and what they don't talk about, is that in the last 35 years, there has been an enormous degree of wealth redistribution. Problem is, it's gone in the wrong direction. "35 years ago, top 1/10 of 1% owned about 7% of the wealth in America. Today, they own about 22% of the wealth in America. But it's not just a grotesque level of wealth inequality, it's also income inequality. Today in Vermont and here in LA, and all across this country, you got people working 2 or 3 jobs. Mama's working, dad's working. Often, never forget this, I was in a high school in northern Vermont, and I asked the kids, just out of curiosity, kids, how many of you work after school? 3/4 of the hands went up. All over this country, you got mom working, dad working, the kids are working, and yet 52% of all new income generated today is going to the top 1%. So the economic reality of America, in one sentence, is that over the last 35 years, middle class of this country, which was once the envy of the world, has been shrinking. You got 43 million people living in poverty, some in desperate poverty, while the very, very richest, top 1%, top 1/10 of 1%, they're getting much richer. In the last 17 years, there has been a 10-fold increase in the number of billionaires in America. Now, I know that that issue makes people uncomfortable. They want to talk about health care, women's rights, gay rights, the environment. But this is an issue that is uncomfortable, taking on billionaires. Billionaires who sometimes donate money to good causes. But I would suggest to you that unless we have the guts to take on the Koch brothers and the billionaire class, we are not going to bring about the kinds of changes this country desperately needs. And it is not just an economic issue. We can sit here and we can say, well, yeah, it's really unfair that so few have so much and so many have so little. That's unfair. Well, but, you know, that's not the end all. But it is the end all in this sense. If you think that the billionaires are putting their money underneath their mattress, they're not. They are investing it into our political system. And as a result of this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, billionaires are now able to spend unlimited sums of money through independent expenditures to buy elections and to support candidates who represent the wealthy and the powerful. And that is why, in my view, not only do we need to overturn Citizens United, we need to move aggressively to public funding of elections. Because what is at stake? I mean, if we were to have a vibrant democracy over here and massive income and wealth inequality over there, you could separate the two. But you cannot separate the two. They are interlaced. The billionaire class is now destroying our democracy, and instead of a nation of one person, one vote, you now have billionaire control over our political system. And on top of that, but not unrelated, you have Republican governors who receive a lot of money from the billionaire class who are too cowardly to defend their political positions and instead want to run in elections and win elections by suppressing the vote, by making it harder for poor people, people of color, older people, and young people to participate, to defend their ideas in an open and free election. What they got to try to do is prevent whole lots of people from voting. Okay. All right. So where we are right now is the need to create an economy, and this is not easy stuff. We need everybody to be thinking about this. How do you do it? Not easy. How do you create an economy that works for the middle class and working families and not just for the billionaires? How do we create, and I want to thank my friends here in California, how do we create here in California a Democratic Party which is open? And I know a lot of people are involved in that struggle, as we are nationally. So those are the two twin issues that I am focusing on. Now let me take you to what's going on in Washington, D.C., and how all of that stuff relates to what you're seeing in D.C. Donald Trump ran for president saying, I, Donald Trump, am a different type of Republican. I'm not Paul Ryan, and he mentioned Ryan by name. I'm not one of those guys. I, Donald Trump, I'm going to take on the establishment, the economic establishment. I'm going to take on Wall Street, and I am going to be a very different type of Republican. I'm not going to cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. I am going to provide health care to everybody. That's what I'm going to do. That's right. And what I think now many of his supporters now understand, and this is, the way I look at politics, I have friends who are conservatives. They believe what they believe, but they're honest. They go home and they say the same thing they say in Washington. But unfortunately, Donald Trump lied to the American people. He told them, and one of the unique problems that we have with the Trump presidency is that he lies every day. Sometimes the media said, well, can you respond to what Trump said yesterday? And I said, no, wait till tomorrow. It will be different. Very hard. But here is what is been consistent. And that is, you saw on Thursday the passage in the House of one of the most disgusting pieces of legislation ever passed by a body of the Congress. Now, you had a president who said, I'm going to provide health care to everybody. It's going to be better. It's going to be less expensive. And yet what Trump and Paul Ryan got through the House was legislation which will throw 24 million Americans off of health care. Now, what I want you to know, this is not rhetoric, this is based in solid fact, there's no disputing this, is that when you throw 24 million people off of health insurance, many of them working people, I don't have a lot of money, and when they get sick and they can't afford to go to a doctor, there is no debate. Many of them will die. Thousands will die. Now, we don't know. No one can predict. No one knows exactly. But what common sense and studies suggest is that if you don't go to the doctor when you are sick and you have something serious, you will become sicker. And then by the time you crawl into the doctor's office, the doctor said, why weren't you here a year ago? It's now too late. No one debates that. Yesterday, the passage of the legislation in the House on Thursday was a death sentence for thousands of our fellow Americans. But let me tell you, that legislation is never going to pass the United States Senate. And let me also tell you that I am not alone in this, there are many who are going to make sure that every Republican who voted for that horrific piece of legislation, not only does it throw 24 million people off of health insurance, it cuts over a 10-year period over $800 billion in Medicaid, which is not only the health care program for lower income people, it also funds 2/3 of the cost of nursing homes in this country. Not only does it do that, it defunds Planned Parenthood. Now, Republicans, in their hypocrisy, talk a lot about choice. They just love choice. But they have now told 2.5 million women who have chosen Planned Parenthood as their medical providers they don't have that choice. That legislation will also substantially raise premiums for older workers in this country. And what else it does, and think about how cruel this is, it tells people with pre-existing conditions that we're going to repeal the mandate that said that insurance companies had to make sure that people with pre-existing conditions, millions of Americans, will continue to get health care at an affordable price. And then, maybe most importantly, what we have got to understand is that this bill was not really a health care bill. You see, you don't pass health care legislation which throws 24 million people off of health insurance and raises premiums. That's not health care. What this bill was about, and this is where we get back to oligarchy and where the ruling class of this country wants to go, and where the Koch brothers, who fund a lot of these things, want to go. What this legislation also did is provide $300 billion in tax breaks for the top 2%, and hundreds of billions more in tax breaks for the drug companies and the insurance companies. Now, it is the oligarchy's attack was not just right now on health care. They are moving into so-called tax reform. Please hear this, that one of the provisions, one of the disastrous proposals being brought forth by the Trump administration and by Republicans for a number of years is the repeal of the estate tax. Now, that does not sound all that sexy. What does that mean, the repeal of the estate tax? What does that mean? Who cares? I'll tell you what it means. I will tell you what it means. And this is where these guys are coming from. What it means is at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, when the very, very rich are getting richer while most Americans are getting poorer, the repeal of the estate tax would provide $353 billion in tax breaks to the top 0.2%. 99.8% of Americans would not benefit by a nickel. At the time when the Walton family, the owners of Walmart, are the wealthiest family in this country, where one family now owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people, that legislation alone would give the Walton family over $50 billion in tax breaks. It would give the Koch brothers family over $30 billion in tax breaks. It would give the Trump family over $4 billion in tax breaks. And while these people want to give unbelievable tax breaks to the very wealthiest people of the oligarchy, they also want to cut not just health care, but they also want to cut after-school programs. They want to cut the WIC program. You know what the WIC program is? The WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children's Program, is a program designed to help and has been very successful in helping low-income pregnant women and their babies. They want to cut the Meals on Wheels program, which is the program that very often provides the one hot, nutritious meal that low-income senior citizens receive. They want to cut the Pell Grant program, which makes it possible for working-class kids to go to college. So just think about it for a second. Massive cutbacks in programs for the children, in housing, in education, in healthcare, massive cutbacks at the same exact time as the Walton family gets a $50 billion tax break. Now, there are very few people in America, I cannot imagine that there are more than 5, 10% maximum, who think they're giving tax breaks to billionaires, cutting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, environmental protection, etc., makes any sense whatsoever. But the reason that they are able to do that is because they have the votes in the Senate and in the House. And the reason they have the votes is because they got a lot of money coming in, and because, in my view, the Democratic Party has not been the grassroots kind of party that it must become. So we have got to take on not just Trump. Trump is simply a front person for the oligarchy of which he is an integral part. It's for the billionaire class. But we have got to figure out and work aggressively to take them on. So there are two things that I think we need to do. Number one, as I said, open up the Democratic Party, transform the Democratic Party, make it a party from the grassroots on up, not from the elite on down. But number two, everything is related to everything else. You can't do that unless you have a program, unless you have an agenda that means something to ordinary Americans. And that takes me to what we discuss in the book. It is essentially a progressive agenda, and on virtually, and this is an important point to make, on virtually all of these issues that I discuss in the book, we already have significant popular support. For example, right now we have millions of Americans who are working longer hours for lower wages. And I'll never forget being in Iowa a year ago or so, talking to somebody who was connected to an emergency food shelf. And I said, just out of curiosity, this was in Des Moines, what percentage of the people who use the food shelf are working people? And he said, oh, over 90%. In other words, people are working. It's not that they're sitting home. It's not that they're unemployed. But their wages are so low, they can't adequately feed their families. And that is why we have got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, $15 an hour. And Senator Murray of Washington and I will soon be introducing that legislation. Now, in terms of health care, it is clear that we have got to defend the Affordable Care Act. We've got to make certain that this Republican House legislation is dead in its tracks. But we also have to be honest and acknowledge that while so-called Obamacare took us a step forward, it added 20 million more Americans to the ranks of the insured, we have got to be honest and acknowledge there are many, many problems with Obamacare. Deductibles, much too high. Co-payments, much too high. Premiums, much too high. Now, a funny thing, you know, it's always hard to keep up with Trump. So the other day, I think it was Thursday, he says, what the House passed was, I forgot his particular adjectives, great, extraordinary, remarkable, best in the world, fantastic, whatever it was. And then he sits next to, only in America, then he sits next to the Australian Prime Minister, and he says, oh, by the way, the Australian healthcare system is better than our healthcare system. Well, I do not often agree with President Trump, but on this issue, he is right. Now, how you in one breath can talk about how great legislation in that throws 24 million people off of health insurance, and then the next breath tell us that the Australian healthcare system is better than ours, that I cannot figure out. But what I say to President Trump, you're right. The Australian healthcare system, like the healthcare systems in every other major country on earth, guarantees healthcare to all of their people as a right. So I say to President Trump, if you like the Australian healthcare system, I am going to give you the opportunity to support my legislation, Medicare for All, single-payer legislation. And I say to my brothers and sisters, here in this great state of California, you can help me, you can help this country pass single payer right here in California. It makes no sense that not only do we remain the only country not to guarantee health care to all people, but we are spending, and I say that to the conservatives out there, we are spending twice as much as any other country per person on health care. And by the way, when we talk about the Australian health care system, they pay 50% of what we pay for prescription drugs. So President Trump, join me, take on the greed and the dishonesty of the pharmaceutical industry. And I don't have to tell the people of California how much money and how much greed there is in that industry. They spent $130 million to defeat Proposition 61 in this state alone. And when we talk about a progressive agenda that speaks to the working class supporters of Trump and speaks to working people all over this country, everybody understands that in a competitive global economy, we need to have the best educated workforce in the world, that most of the good jobs being created today require a higher education. And that is why we will make public colleges and universities tuition free. And people say, well, you know, Bernie, great idea. You want to make public colleges, universities, tuition-free. You want to substantially lower student debt. How are you going to pay for it? Well, I will tell you exactly how we're going to pay for it. If this country and you could bail out the crooks on Wall Street, it is Wall Street's time to help the working class of this country. Which is why we will impose a tax on Wall Street speculation. Now, one of the more painful embarrassments of the Trump administration, and there are many, is that we have the President of the United States rejecting what virtually the entire scientific community is telling us, and that is climate change is real, it is caused by human activity, it is already doing devastating harm in this country and all over the world. So together, for the sake of our children, our grandchildren, and future generations, we have got to have the courage to take on the fossil fuel industry and transform our energy system. The fossil fuel industry reminds me in many ways of what the tobacco industry was about 50 or 60 years ago. And that is, they lied all of the time. They were on television having doctors smoking cigarettes. Oh, this is great. Actually good for your health. Yeah. Smoke this, smoke that. Well, they knew that tobacco caused cancer and heart disease and emphysema. And they're still selling a product which kills people all over the world. But they lied. And the fossil fuel industry is the same. These are not stupid people. They understand that their product is causing the warming of this planet with enormous consequence. Our job is to take on this very, very powerful industry, and for the sake of our kids and future generations, transform our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energies like wind, solar, and geothermal. And when we do that, because all of you are aware there's an explosion in technology and sustainable energy, cost of solar is plummeting. In fact, in Chile right now, they negotiated a contract in which a solar utility company will be providing the cheapest electricity ever produced in the world from any source. And that will only continue. So for the sake of our planet, for the sake of a clean environment so our kids do not have to breathe filthy air and get asthma, for the sake of job creation, because we can create millions of jobs in wind, solar, energy efficiency, we have got to take on that greedy industry and transform our energy system. And when we talk about international embarrassments, we should be profoundly embarrassed. This has nothing to do with Trump. It's gone on way before Trump. The fact that we have more people in jail than any other country on earth. We have a broken criminal justice system that cries out for reform. There are minority communities in inner cities all over this country where youth unemployment is 20, 30, 40%, and you have similar numbers in rural America. I talked to a guy in Florida a few weeks ago. He said, no, we don't have a drug problem. We have a drug economy. A drug economy. That's where the young people are making their money, because there's nothing out there for them. So I say that maybe, just maybe, We should be investing for our young people in jobs and education, not in jails and incarceration. And one of the reasons that Trump won the election, as all of you know, is that he has tried to divide us up. Divide us up. All of you know, or should know, that the history of our country is a history of immigrants. My father came to this country from Poland. Your parents came from someplace else. But we are a nation of immigrants, and our diversity is what makes us strong. And right now, in an incredibly ugly and racist way, what Trump is trying to do is to divide us up. We are supposed to hate our Latino brothers and sisters. We're supposed to hate Muslims. I don't know who we're supposed to hate today. Haven't read the papers yet. But all of you know that's what demagogues always do. They always scapegoat minorities. They don't have the guts to take on Wall Street or the billionaire class. Whether it's Le Pen, whether it's Trump, they try to divide the people up. And instead of scapegoating minorities in this country, instead of scapegoating immigrants in this country, we have got to pass comprehensive immigration reform and a path towards citizenship. So, brothers and sisters, we have got a lot of work in front of us. Now, I know that there are people all over the country who are discouraged. There are people all over the country who are depressed. There are people who are throwing up their hands and saying, I give up. But let me just say this. This is not just about you. This is about your children and your grandchildren, and in the case of climate change, literally about the future of this planet. Despair is not an option. Now, everybody has a different idea as to how they can be most effective. In California, it might be different than Vermont, and it might be different than Nebraska or Wyoming. But what we have got to do is throw ourselves, broadly speaking, into the political process in a way that we have never done before. And I want to remind everybody, and it's important because the media doesn't do it, so let me take this opportunity to give you a short, brief sense of American history. I want you to remember that 150 years ago, from an historical point of view, not such a long time ago, in this country, people were living in slavery. And incredibly brave people, some of who died, some of who were jailed, stood up and fought back at great personal risk to themselves to say that in America, not only will we abolish the abomination of slavery, we are going to end racism and segregation in this country. So you think you got a problem today, put yourself back 100, 150 years ago in this country as an African American or somebody fighting for the rights of African Americans. Think about the fact that 100 years ago today, and children don't know it. We don't do very well explaining American history. 100 years ago in America, women did not have the right to vote, did not have the right to get the higher education they wanted or do the work they wanted. But incredibly brave women stood up and they went to jail, and they sometimes died. In saying that in America, women will not be second-class citizens. And while we have a long way to go, both in terms of civil rights and ending racism, and in terms of women's rights and ending sexism, no one can deny that we have made significant progress because of the determination and courage of those people who stood up against all of the odds. Think about workers 150 years ago in this country had no rights. You're working 70 hours a week. You don't like it, you're fired. And we had children in factories, children 10, 12 years old, in factories and on fields, working their fingers to the bone, never getting an education. But workers stood up with great courage and formed unions and said, we're human beings. And some of those workers were killed. And some of those workers were beaten in order to make certain that workers could sit down with their bosses and engage in collective bargaining. And those workers gave us the 40-hour work week and overtime and Medicare and Medicaid. That's what they accomplished. And I want you to think about today, if you think things are bad today and just suddenly, I don't know, oh my God, this is the first time in American history we're facing dark moments. You think about being gay in America 30 years ago, right now, our lifetimes, and the humiliation that gay people suffered because of the homophobia that existed, and the incredible courage of people in the gay community to say, you know what, I'm a human being, I will love whoever I want, regardless of my gender. Let me give you a more recent example about how change takes place, because I want you to think about all of those groups, whether it's workers, women, African Americans, gay community, whatever it may be. This is how change takes place. If we were here 6 or 7 years ago, and somebody jumps up and says, you know, Bernie, this $7.25 federal minimum wage is a starvation wage. And you know, I want you, Bernie, go back to the Senate, and I want you to double that minimum wage to $15 an hour. Now, the person next to her would have said, you're crazy. What are you talking about? You can't double the minimum wage. It's unhistorical. Never happens. Maybe we can get it up to $9 an hour. Maybe get it up to $10 an hour. But going from 7.25 to 15, unthinkable. You're too radical. You're thinking too big. And yet what happened with incredible courage is people in the fast food industry, the folks who work in McDonald's and Burger King, they went out on strike. And they told the world that you can't make it on $8 or $9 an hour. And then suddenly in Seattle and in California and in New York and in communities all over this country, people started passing legislation of $15 an hour. In Congress, I think 4 or 5 years ago, the bold Democrats were talking about raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. Right now in the Democratic Party platform and legislation that I will introduce, $15 an hour. That's what happens. That is what happens when you are prepared to think big, not small. Real change can take place. So our job in this pivotal moment in American history is to think big, not small, to think smart, to think courageously. And here is the very good news. Very few Americans, not in California, not in Mississippi, not in Nebraska, not in the most conservative states in this country, very few Americans believe that it makes any sense at all to give tax breaks to billionaires and to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. They don't believe that. Our job now, and this is not easy stuff, is to reach out to people who, for whatever reason, may disagree with us on this issue or that issue, but to bring our people together to fight for a government which finally represents all of us and not just the 1%. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We have a few minutes for a couple questions, so I'd like to ask them. So we populated these from social media and email. First question is, Arthur asks, President Trump seems to put short-term economic concerns like jobs for the coal mining industry above environmental concerns that can have long-lasting or even permanent damage to the environment, like dismantling the EPA, denying the science of climate change, expanding offshore drilling, and the use of fossil fuels. How can we prevent the president from doing irreparable damage to Mother Earth?
Well, whether it is the environment or women's rights, protecting a woman's right to choose, whether it is serious job creation or raising the minimum wage, on all of these issues, it comes down to millions of people standing up and fighting back. On this particular issue, let us be very clear. If we are concerned about protecting the environment and combating climate change, and at the same time as I am, we are concerned about creating jobs, there is no contradiction. The truth is, we can create a hell of a lot more jobs by transforming our energy system away from fossil fuel. There has been an explosion of jobs in sustainable energy in recent years. But having said that, what we should also be clear about is that if and when we move away from fossil fuels, there will be people who, through no fault of their own, hardworking, decent people, no job is harder than working in a coal mine. And our job is not to leave these people out there without the protection that they need. They've got families that they have got to provide for, and that is why I have proposed a $41 billion piece of legislation which rebuilds those communities. We don't leave these people out on the streets. We're going to provide the jobs and the education and the health care that they need. So, but bottom line, if you're interested in job creation, then investing in sustainable energy and energy efficiency is the way to go.
Amy asks, in addition to tensions with North Korea, what are the global threats that are most pressing, given Trump's unpredictable foreign policy positions?
I'm standing 2 feet away from you and I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Amy asks, in addition to tensions with North Korea, what are the global threats that are most pressing, given Trump's unpredictable foreign policy positions?
Well, it's not just Trump on these things. You know, we can't blame every problem in the world on Trump. There were 1 or 2 problems that were around before Trump became president. I'll tell you, let me just tell you a story. Not a story, and it's, you know, when you're a senator, you see things that are just beyond belief. 2 weeks ago, I had a middle-aged man and a middle-aged woman walking into my office. They were with a group called the White Helmets. I don't know if that means anything. Does that mean something? And you see this woman walking in there. She detonates bombs. That's what she does. bombs that haven't exploded. Her job is to take them apart so they don't explode. And the other guy, the guy there, his job is to pick people up out of rubble after the bombing. And we talked a little bit about Syria. Syria is a country, I think, of about 19, 20 million people. And what they said, and listen to this, it's unbelievable. This is what they said, and I believe them. They said before the chemical weapons went off last month, Assad's army bombed the nearby hospitals to make it harder for people exposed to chemical weapons to get the medical care they needed. I mean, you sit and you think and you say, my God, how can anybody think about those things? And then in that one country, you got about 500,000 people of a nation of about 20 million who have been killed. I don't know how many have been wounded. You got millions who have left the nation and are now immigrants, and others who have been displaced from their homes. Unbelievable suffering from a guy who will do apparently anything to retain his power. The challenge there, which is not an easy challenge, if we do not want to get sucked into another war, and I happen to believe the war in Iraq was the worst foreign policy blunder in the history, modern history of this country. So I think what has got to happen, again, none of this stuff is easy and it predated Trump, is we have got to tell Russia and Iran that they cannot continue to support a brutal dictator like Assad. North Korea, another not easy problem. You got an isolated nation which has nuclear weapons, which apparently now is working overtime to expand their missile capabilities and their nuclear capabilities in terms of being able to put a nuclear bomb on top of a missile. And here we have to be working, I believe, very closely with China, who receives about 80% of the exports from North Korea. So we're going to have to work with China to do everything that we can to reach a solution, and at the very least, put a freeze on North Korea's missile and nuclear development. I think in terms of Iran, I think while the Obama administration was criticized roundly, that was a very difficult process, but I think the ends were successful. And that is that there is at least, we have made progress in freezing Iranian nuclear capabilities. But all of these efforts are not easy, and I don't want to suggest they predated Trump. But what we need in all of them is a global response. It cannot just be the United States. We need the international community working together. That is why, and the solutions, and there are people, even in Trump's administration who understand it. What they want to do is cut back significantly on the State Department while they greatly expand military spending. And you got sane people in the State Department who say, no, that is a stupid thing to do. If you want to stop terrorism, you got to go into poor countries and let the people in those countries know that we are on their side. And it's not just going to be getting into war and war and war. So all of this stuff is not easy stuff. And it's not, again, Trump didn't create these problems. But I think our job is to do everything we can to understand that wars are not the answer, that negotiations are, and that we need a global response, not a unilateral response to these crises.
Based on your recent support of Heath Mello, do you agree with Nancy Pelosi's position this past week that, quote, the Democratic Party should not impose support for abortion rights as a litmus test on its candidates?
Let me tell you about that situation. My view, and as I've tried to indicate today, is that the model of the Democratic Party is broken. Their strategy has failed. Now, ideally, I would feel great if everybody in 50 states agreed with me about everything. That would be terrific. But I can't get my wife to agree with me about everything, and certainly not my kids, so I don't think that is going to happen. So here is the reality, and this is the reality that we have to deal with. Not only today does the Republican Party control the White House, the Senate, and the House. They control almost 2/3 of the governor's chairs in America. And in the last 9 years, they have gained almost 1,000 legislative seats in state houses all over America. In this country today, as I understand it, Republicans completely control 25 state governments. That means the governor, state house, and state senate. That's where we are today. Now, a gentleman who I guess has become nationally famous, I'm sure when he was running for mayor of Omaha, Nebraska, never thought that he would become a national name, but his name is Heath Mello. And I was invited, along with Keith Ellison, to go to a rally in Omaha. And we went to this rally. And this rally had about 6,000 people in one of the reddest states in America. And we had up there trade unionists, we had African Americans in the community, and Latinos, and Native Americans, and we had women advocates, and we had a fantastic rally for Heath Mello to be mayor. The election, by the way, is Tuesday. I suspect it'll be a close election, and I certainly hope that he wins. He is running against an incumbent mayor who, a few days after I was in Omaha, brought in Scott Walker, the most reactionary governor in the country, to campaign for her. So that's the choice. You have Heath Mello, who wants to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, has the strong support of the environmental community, and so forth and so on. Now, I learned a few days before I went to Omaha that Heath is a Catholic who is personally anti-choice. And that is the fact. So there are two questions. Number one, should the Democratic Party be a strong, vigorous, uncompromising, pro-choice party? The answer is yes. But number two, right now in Washington, in the House and in the Senate, the overwhelming, I'm guessing somewhere about 90% or more, of Democrats in the Senate and in the House are pro-choice. But you know what? There is very little that we can do to stop the war against women because we are in the minority. So if you are asking me if in communities around this country where people's views may be different than mine and where they are nominating in their own process somebody who is strong on workers' issues, on the environment, on human rights, etc., but for personal reasons, he is a Catholic, and that's his view, as is Tim Kaine, the vice presidential candidate, and others. Should we say, no, we don't want those people in the Democratic Party? And I say, no, that is bad politics. Because I would rather be a party in the Senate which has 85% pro-choice and the majority, rather than being 90% pro-choice and the minority. So what we have got to recognize, and I know this is difficult, and I know that not everybody agrees with me, and I accept that. That's part of the debate in a democratic society. But I think we have got to understand that in what politics is about is not everybody in this room is going to agree on every issue. I have supported people for high offices who voted against the war in Iraq. That wasn't a litmus test. I have supported people all over this country who voted for disastrous trade agreements. I have supported people who voted terribly incorrectly to deregulate Wall Street. And what we have got to understand in a democratic society, the best you can do is bring people together around as many issues as we can come together around. I have a 100% pro-choice voting record, and I always will. That is what I believe, all right? But we have got to we have got to respect and understand there are decent people, working class people, who want to take on Wall Street, who want to take on the billionaire class. Their religious background is different. And it is not my view that you throw them out and shut the door and say, sorry, you can't come in. So that's a long answer to a short question. Maybe one more.
One more. Dolores asks, today is the French presidential election. We have seen the rise of right-wing populism around the world. What do you see as our role as global citizens?
Well, we have seen the rise of right-wing populism not only all over the world, but right here in our own backyard, haven't we? So I think the answer is twofold. And again, my profound congratulations and respect for the people of France, who today, in an overwhelming vote, said no to xenophobia and racism and ultra-nationalism. Here is my response. Number one, we have got to be as strong as we possibly can in saying we are not going to let demagogues divide us up. This country, as all of you know, what we have gone through in terms of racism and sexism and discrimination against Asian Americans and against Catholics and against Italians and Irish and Jews, we have been through it. We've been through it all. And our job is not to allow demagogues to divide us up based on whether you were born in Mexico or born in Los Angeles. We can't allow that to happen. But equally important, we have to understand that a lot of that anti-immigrant sentiment is based on the facts that people are really hurting in this country. And demagogues are saying to them, you don't have a job, or you're making $8 an hour, and your kid can't go to college, and you can't afford health care. You know what the fault is? It's the immigrants. And our job is to come up, to bring those people who are hurting today, to acknowledge their pain, to acknowledge that the global economy has left them behind, and to create a nation not which is ruled by money, not to say, oh, it's okay. Hey, you're a large multinational, and you can make $10 more by shutting down here and moving to China, and you don't have to worry about the thousands of workers you're throwing out on the street. No, you can't do that. So our job is to reach out to those people, to understand their pain, and to bring them into our fold as we fight for an economy of decent jobs and decent wages, decent health care, decent educational opportunity. Well, let me just thank all of you for being here, and let me thank the sponsors of this. Let's go forward together. Thank you all very much.